Are you curious about the unknown, the unexplainable? Do you find yourself intrigued by the mysterious and paranormal side of our world? Join us on an adventure into the world of inexplicable discoveries and investigations that may someday give us the final answer as to what may be behind the veil of reality. The borders of space and time have opened once again, and transmitting from the mountains of West Virginia, it's time once again for Let's Find Out with Diego. The universe is waiting for you.
The borders of space and time have opened once again and transmitting from the mountains of West Virginia. It's another episode of Let's Find Out with Diego. Thank you for taking this journey with me. On this episode of Let's Find Out, our guest's journey into the mysterious and otherworldly began at a young age. Fascinated by aliens, cryptids, and all things strange, his curiosity sparked into a full-blown passion for a recovered memory of a childhood Men in Black encounter. He delved headfirst into serious UFO research, eventually founding the framework UFO Research Center. As one of the co-hosts of the Bizarre Encounters podcast, he fearlessly explores the unexplained, inviting listeners on thrilling quests into the unknown realms of mystery and the paranormal. All this plus more. Please welcome to Let's Find Out a good friend of our show, podcaster and researcher, Orin Felix. Orin, my friend, welcome to Let's Find Out, man. I've been looking forward to talking to you again since I saw you a couple of weeks ago at, the Cryptid Halloween over there in Ranson.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's, like I said before we started recording, always a pleasure to get to see you and chat with you a little bit. And that was quite the intro. You made me sound much more accomplished and official than I really am. So thank you for that.
No, man, you're 100% legit, my. That's why I believe Snarly invites people like us, man, because, you know, we're always out there searching for truth and mysteries. And, you know, and going back to Snarly, he always puts on these great events. That's how you and I and your partner met last year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or at the American Legion, I think it was Cryptid Halloween 2.
Yes, sir. Yeah, definitely. Cryptid Halloween 2. And then this year, you know, they had it at the new venue, which I thought was just awesome. I'm so excited to see how that event kind of grows. And hopefully you and I and, you know, our little group get to all grow with it.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because I've driven by there several times. It's not, I could throw a rock at it from my house.
Really?
And I've never seen a parking lot that busy ever. Not at any event.
Well, there was just so many cool vendors, and it seemed, I mean, it was hard to tell as big as the venue was, but it seemed like they had a crowd all day. Like you said, the parking lot was full. It seemed like there was a steady stream of people. So, you know, I hope Dave had a good turnout and considers the event a success, because I certainly did. And, you know, he's the nicest guy ever, and he deserves all the success and good things that come his way.
Very true, my friend. He's one of the best out there, the most honest person I ever met in all space and time, considerably speaking of that. Now, going into the reason why we're here, my friend, I was reading over the bio that you sent me, and I find something very interesting because I don't know about you, because I know you have a show with your partner, Shane, and you've probably interviewed hundreds of people, as I have, where experiences happen to them at a very young age. Mm-hmm. And it seems sometimes it carries them through adulthood. And there's sometimes, like with me, it started at a young age, and there was like a break in between, and then nothing for a while. And as you get older, you start piecing these things together.
Absolutely.
There comes a time where you receive I like to, you know, we call it a recovered memory, or sometimes you get what people call it a download of sorts, where you go somewhere or you talk to somebody, you see a picture, and it triggers a memory. And it's hard to explain how that happens. And it kind of almost takes you back, kind of like a quantum leap moment where Scott Bakula, he gets sent back to a certain time. But it's that's the best way for me to explain it. So tell me about this experience that you had as a young age, because you're probably only the second person I've met since I've done this show, going into this third year now, where there was an experience with a Men in Black. How did this happen? Where did it happen?
Okay, so a little bit of background. I grew up in Eastern North Carolina. The property that my parents lived on was like across the creek from a very large military base. It's Camp Lejeune, if anybody out there is interested. I don't know if the commercials air, where you're at, but there's like this huge toxic water class action lawsuit going on right now.
Yes.
That's the place. So anyway, we lived right across the creek from that military base. And so growing up, there was always like helicopters doing maneuvers and planes flying over and all sorts of military activity. And when we'd have, like guests come in from out of town, the bombs going off and the helicopters always like terrified them. And like, we didn't even notice at that point because it was just what we were used to. But anyway, so I was probably 8 or 9 at the time. And I was homeschooled when I was young. And it was me and my mom and my little sister, just sitting at home doing schoolwork one day. It was probably in the, late spring, early summer. And this white van pulled up in our front yard. And in my recollection, it's like just the typical mid-90s, like Chevy Astro van, just very generic white van. And out of the van, these 2 guys got out. And again, my recollection is they had like black pants, short sleeve, white shirts, black ties, black sunglasses, no jackets or anything. But again, this is the summer in North Carolina. It's hot and humid. But anyway, so these guys start like making a perimeter around our yard and like looking, on kind of like the coast marsh line where, the property and the water met. And, at the time, we had like, Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that come and visit the house. And this clearly wasn't that. My mom was scared by what was happening. And she said, take your sister, go hide in my bedroom closet. If I don't come back in a little while and get you, take your sister, run down the road to your aunt's house and, get help. So anyway, a few minutes later, my mom came and got me and my sister out of the closet. And what's so strange about the encounter is it wasn't discussed at all. Like my mom didn't say anything about it. We like when my dad came home from work that night, we didn't discuss it. It wasn't even, hey, this weird thing happened today. It was just kind of all swept under the rug. And funny enough, you're talking about recovered memories and how that one thing just sparks this whole, thought process. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago at this point. But I was, funny enough, watching an episode of Ancient Aliens about the Men in Black. And it was some encounter that they were talking about on that show. And I said, oh my God, that happened to me. And it, like you said, just this flood of memories came back. And soon after that, me and my mom, ended up being on like a road trip together. And in the car for hours. At some point, I just said, hey, I remember this thing happening. Did this actually happen? And my mom was like, yeah, that totally happened. And she said it happened exactly like, the story I just told, how I recalled it. And, at that point, that was toward the end of my mom's life. And she had gotten more into like esoteric and kind of strange things at that point. And, I was just discussing it with her. I was like, what happened? What happened when you like went outside to see what these guys were doing? She said, I have no idea. I don't have any recollection of what happened between when I sent you and your sister to the closet and when I came and got you guys. So, she kind of joked, but not joked that she got zapped by the Men in Black when this happened. So that's kind of the long and short of the actual encounter experience, whatever you want to call it.
And with that, what was, because you mentioned something about having a perimeter. Do you recall, other than, I guess, the vehicles and them, you recall seeing anything? Or let me go back. Forgive me, because when we start talking about these things, I get kind of excited. And all these things I want to say try to come out at once.
No, I understand.
Did anybody else in the neighborhood have any reports or tell you anything?
So where we lived, it was probably like a quarter mile, half mile off of like the main road. It was very secluded. We had like no close neighbors. It was on farmland that was owned by my grandpa. So there was like nobody around. And again, like all this type of military activity was just so commonplace that most people around there just didn't even notice it.
I mean, and that makes sense. Now, in Carolina, and back in my oldest, I used to travel to Carolina a lot, all over the
Mhm.
states, and towns that people have heard of and towns that people have never heard of. And that's the beautiful thing about North Carolina, really. Um, best of my knowledge, Carolina is not very well known for UFO activities, but
Mhm.
it's very big with, of course, paranormal, especially cryptids.
Mhm.
There's been times where, or reports that I've read, I'm sure you've read the same books, where a lot of military action when it comes to like dogmen or Bigfoot or things like that. Of course, UFOs, if there's a UFO landing of any sorts, but is that something common in Carolina with the UFO activity?
You know, I've been on like the MUFON website and I've tried to look into all sorts of reports, on this journey trying to piece this information together. And like you said, it's not really an area that's known for a lot of UFO activity. And like I said, I wonder how much of this could be there is activity going on. People just automatically assume it's a plane or a helicopter or some sort of military training, testing, something like that. So maybe there are things that are going on and it's just not reported because people don't realize what it is, especially in that very specific area.
Yes, and with because I've lived in here in Virginia is a well West Virginia now. While I lived in Virginia most of my whole life, it's a very
Mhm.
military state because you have
Mhm.
Norfolk with Navy, you have in DC area all the different law enforcement agencies and or military and whatnot. When things when shit goes down, you know when shit goes down.
Mhm.
And but I think when it's related to UFOs, handle it a little bit different.
Mhm.
Not like when you see state patrols or chasing after a stolen car or murderers or anything like that. Why am I going down this direction? Because it seems that when things like that happen, you don't really get anybody visiting your door.
Yeah.
You know, maybe when they say, "Hey, have you seen this person? We're looking for this person." But when it comes to UFO, it's handled so much differently. It's almost like they just say, "Don't say nothing."
Mhm.
What has been your experience so far with people on your show that talked about UFOs? What do they have in common to when they witness something and perhaps they get contacted by an agency to where they say, "Well, maybe you should stop talking about this or come come down here with us at the station and talk about it." What's been your experience so far?
So funny enough, since I've been on the show, we haven't really talked to anybody who had a Men in Black encounter. I mean, we've talked to a couple people who had UFO encounters, a couple abductees even, but no one specifically mentioned this kind of Men in Black side of the equation. And as I was unpacking this and trying to put the pieces together, I initially thought, okay, well, they must have been looking for something, like you would assume, there's a sighting, the crash, something like that. And then the Men in Black show up and they investigate. But as I got thinking about this situation more and more, now I'm kind of under the persuasion that they were seeing what we could see from our property. Because, like I said, the base was right across the water. I mean, and I say across the water, but like very close. I mean, probably less than a half a mile if you went by boat. So, I think that, and this is something I've talked about on our show a lot, national parks and military bases, I don't think are chosen just their locations for them aren't chosen because of their, just natural beauty or defense purposes. I think sometimes that could be so the government, the military, whatnot, can hide things that are there, whether that be portals or, you mentioned dogmen and things like that. And that gets a lot into like the national parks type thing. But I almost wonder if some of the high strangeness in this area, if that's why this base is there and not vice versa. And maybe something, got out, or maybe something happened and they wanted to make sure we couldn't see it from where we were at. And at this point, after, years of talking to different people such as yourself and unpacking this situation, that's kind of where I fall on it.
It makes perfect sense only because it's going to sound funny. I don't know what state this is, where a bunch of monkeys escaped from a. You're laughing because you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think I heard something about that not so long ago.
And not so long as it being lookout, keep your door shut and your window shut because these monkeys have escaped from this lab or this location. Mm-hmm. And it might have been one of those things that where perhaps at that installation, something must have escaped, because if something would have crashed, I think it would have been a far more reported thing, or far more people would be outside looking as well, not only with your neighbors, but as far as law enforcement and, of course, military. So I'll go with what you're saying there. Something must have escaped from there.
Yeah, or, it could be something as simple as a test went wrong or something like that. I think, like I said, I'm of the opinion that they're making sure we couldn't see something. And whatever that something is, your guess is as good as mine. But, like we said, with the high strangeness in that general area, it could be anything. But, something else that people talk about in a lot of Men in Black encounters is, there's pretty much two schools of thought. It's the, kind of John Keel, otherworldly, ultra-terrestrial type Men in Black. And then there's the, these are just government agents doing a job. And granted, I was not face-to-face with these guys. My mom can't remember or couldn't remember any of her interaction with them. But just from afar, I did not get the impression that these were some sort of otherworldly or ultra-terrestrial type entity. It struck me as these are, government agents checking up on something.
And you kind of beat me to the punch. So I was going to ask you what these Men in Black were. In the past, I've read reports and listened to testimony where they might be mixed, where there may be some humans there. So I'm going to call it a unit for all, for the sake of conversation. Mm-hmm. This unit, or however many, half a dozen, 3 or 4 of these individuals dressed similarly, where some of them look human, but there's been some that said that some of these like very pale faced, expressionless beings. So, and never hear them talk. Mm-hmm. So, what's your take on that? I mean, because I know you just said what you saw, but have you heard this before as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think in a lot of things in the paranormal realm with cryptids or aliens or anything like that, more than one thing can be true at a time. And I think there absolutely could be this more otherworldly, robotic type entity. They talk about how, they talk in like a very mechanical, sing-songy type voice. So I think that could be a very real thing that happens. And I do think there probably is also just this, flesh and blood government branch, and whether they're, trying to use the guise of the Men in Black to intimidate people and keep information from slipping out. It's kind of a chicken or the egg situation, but I think there is more than one thing going on. And I think in anything in the paranormal, when we try to pigeonhole ourselves into, okay, this is the one explanation, we're doing ourselves a disservice at that point. And, I'm a big fan of the saying, I say it all the time on the show, like I said, more than one thing can be true at a time. And these things could be connected in some way, or it could, like I said, just be the government's kind of piggybacking off of this other phenomenon. Who knows?
Sure. And I think it also depends on the individual and their perception of what things could be. And I think religious upbringing and culture can bring a lot to the table when it comes to, I guess, describing these events.
Absolutely.
And if you don't mind me asking, so I don't want to age myself on this, but during what time period was this Men in Black experience?
So I will be 35 here in a couple weeks, and I was like 8 or 9. So this was late 90s. I'd say 98, 99, 2000, somewhere in that time frame. So it was
Perfect.
after
I'm
like the
glad you
Will
said.
Smith Men in Black movie came out. So there was a little bit of like, I think, cultural frame of reference for that sort of thing.
Right. Perfect, because that kind of helps me out with what I was going to say. During my time, I'm a 70s guy raised in the 80s. In order for you to hear these types of things, you really have to go dig down deep and look for it.
Mm-hmm.
In the library, where, we had a Dewey Decimal System card catalog, we have microfiche, and every once in a while you'll hear and see these documentaries, like In Search of Leonard Nimoy back then was a very big thing in the 70s,
Right.
with reruns. If you were blessed enough to Von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods,
Mm-hmm.
which I didn't really discover until much later in adulthood. But these kind of things trickled very slowly. But I think in the 90s, once technology started evolving, you started seeing more things on television. One of the ones that I think really did a great job, and I don't technically think it, doesn't matter what I think about it, that alien autopsy thing that came out, I think it was on Fox, where I think people started looking into this again, however you fall into the side of whether it's real or not. That's okay. It's not a purpose of the show, but I think that something happened because now internet came in later, and then cable TV channels started popping up, and then into the 2000s we get Ancient Aliens, and that's where the shit really hit the fan, where people are like,
Yeah.
holy crap, because people were now looking at history completely different than they
Absolutely.
think they were listening back in the day. So how did your knowledge expand in this subject? Meaning your interest, when did it rise more? It had to do something with the trigger memory, but I think as these subjects came more to light.
Yeah, so I think you're spot on with everything you just said. Like we talked about a little bit in the wonderful bio intro that you did. I was just like always into stuff like this, even as a kid. Like I remember kind of, I guess probably as a child, my gateway into all this sort of thing was the Loch Ness Monster. I loved the Loch Ness Monster. I was obsessed with it. And then, funny enough, around the same time period, maybe probably a little bit before Ancient Aliens, there was a show on the History Channel called Monster Quest, where they would pick a cryptid, and of course they have an expedition and they go off in the woods and try to find this cryptid. Spoiler alert, they never find it, but it talks about like the history of the Mothman, or various like Bigfoot type entities. But I loved that show. Like it was, I don't know, one day a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, something like that. They would just run reruns of it all day, and I would just sit there for hours and watch that show. And getting a little bit older and going off to college and all that, kind of fell away from that a little bit until, like you said, Ancient Aliens came on. And whether we're talking about Ancient Aliens or any of the various Expedition Bigfoot type shows, I know a lot of people kind of poo-poo and look down on those shows. And of course, anything they put on TV, it's going to have an agenda. There's going to be a narrative that the creators are trying to further. But I think anything like that gets people questioning and just thinking about things in a different way and considering different possibilities and conclusions that they've never considered before, I think all that's a good thing. And how many people are looking into weird stuff like this because of Ancient Aliens? And so whether everything that's in that show is quote unquote true or not is irrelevant to me. I think there's two things that have done more good for the paranormal, and I don't care what anybody thinks about the actual subject matter, but I think Joe Rogan and Ancient Aliens has done more to get people thinking and looking at things in a different way than anything else. And like you said, without technology and in the 80s and 90s, we just weren't in a place where things like this could happen. And then between podcasts and that big thing that happened a few years ago where people were not going to work and were at home and had time to look into interests and listen to podcasts and discover things, I think we're kind of at a sweet spot right now with people just not accepting what we've always been told. And that was kind of a long-winded answer. I apologize, but I can get on my soapbox with things like this.
No, that's what we're here for. Sometimes my questions are more like stories until I remember what I was going to ask you. So I kind of fell into that. You saved me on that one, but it was a game changer. Ancient Aliens, and I tell you, I mean, I think you know why, but it forced people to think differently. Because when I was growing up, it wasn't called this yet. And maybe it has, but it was called the ancient astronaut.
Hmm.
Oh my gosh, was it? Is that what it was called?
The
I'm
ancient
losing it.
astronaut theory.
Yes, and the
Yeah.
panspermia and the
Hmm.
intelligent design, those kind of things were kind of there, but they were not in fashion.
Hmm.
Where a lot of questions is how can these things be built, like these pyramids,
Hmm.
like these super humongous structures that there's no way that a human had the technology to do this at that time. And there is something to that, whether it's ancient alien technology, fallen angel technology. We can
Hmm.
go on all night about that. Why is it important, ancient aliens? Because now it's not just people telling you, hey, this is what could happen. Well, let me show you how it could have happened.
Hmm.
Let me tell you the stories and folklore, because a lot of that ties in with the way we're perceiving these things now.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny when you kind of dig into some of these ancient myths, quote unquote myths. Everybody's telling the same story. Like I said, they're just calling things differently. More than one thing can be true at the same time, but everybody's telling the same story. Every ancient culture, their creation story is there was some celestial, godly component that came down and mixed themselves with some, earthly component. What the names change, but the story's the same. It could be, the dust of the ground or what, but every story is the same. And that leads me to believe that this isn't a story. This is in some way what actually happened. I'm a believer that ancient alien technology, ancient alien theory, all that sort of thing did happen. I mean, I feel like aliens have visited Earth. I feel like they continue to visit Earth. I feel like they had a very big role into getting humanity and the human species to where they are right now. But again, more than one thing can be true at the same time. I feel like a lot of those visits are kind of few and far between. I feel like when you're working on basically infinite timelines like these gods, aliens, whatever you want to call them, angels, whatever they are, I feel like they're not just coming here all the time. So I feel like a lot of the kind of ongoing UFO sightings and reports, I think they can fall into three categories. One of them, of course, just, misidentified natural phenomenon, whether it be weather balloons, ball light, the typical
Yeah.
explanations. I think at this point, a large number of those sightings are government and military technology, whether it be ours or somebody else's. And I think it behooves the government for them to not admit that these things are theirs. And I think, the smallest percentage of the sightings are true to foil, real extraterrestrial, alien, whatever you want to call it, encounters. And, if 1% of all of those encounters are a legitimate unexplained otherworldly thing, that's still a lot of encounters. And yeah, again, another long-winded answer, but
No, and I was talking to somebody not too long ago, and I asked them this question, and I love their answer. My thing is that it seems that back when I'm gonna say several thousand years ago,
mhm.
where these poor people, I call them poor people who never know about technology,
Mhm.
they they saw these extraterrestrials come down from whatever, a ship or descended somehow, could easily confuse them as gods. So I
Yeah.
think these aliens had an easier time getting them to comply to do what they wanted to
Mhm.
do, whether it was slave labor, whether it was whatever they needed them for.
Mhm.
If you subscribe to the Sumerian tales with Zechariah Sitchin with the Lost Book of Enki, which when mankind went, I'm gonna say different phases, but different phases of DNA manipulation to where they
Mhm.
finally found that worker. I said slave class, but worker class to get them to do what they needed them to do, which was, I believe, at that point, Nibiru had some sort of issues with their atmosphere and they needed a working class dig for gold.
Yeah, I've heard all
Use
those
that
tales.
right. So you've heard that. So there's something to that because there's always seems to be is they always need humans for something, and then it evolves from there. But another long-winded one, just like you, my friend. I understand what you're saying. Where I asked it, like it seems like we go through these gaps to where we haven't had contact. I'm going to call it with a god in so long. The only thing I can go back to, what I would say is the 1800s. Is the 18 or 1700s when Joseph Smith had the encounter with Moroni?
And when you read that now, something I say all the time on the show is so much of this type of thing can be boiled down to issues of language. And it's people describing indescribable things with the best language they have. And if you read the Joseph Smith encounter, that's an alien encounter. If that happened today, we'd call it a UFO alien visitation. Even not to sound sacrilegious, if you read the Bible, Jonah and the whale, change one word of that story and it's subterrestrial, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but that's an alien abduction story. Even, the Immaculate Conception of Jesus, change one word, that's an alien abduction story.
And when you look at it through, and I'm full disclosure with me, I come from a Pentecostal background. I'm a Protestant, but at the same time, it kind of helped me make sense of certain stories and what it could have possibly been.
Yeah.
Now that I don't believe the way it happened, I don't want people, don't send me the emails, please, but it starts making more sense.
Absolutely.
Which it kind of solidifies the story better if you really think about it. Now, since the time of Joseph Smith, I have not seen any evidence of anything to that magnitude. Since then, I have a theory, Orin. If I want you to, if you could hear this,
yeah, absolutely,
and tell me right or wrong, which is fine by me. Which I think now there's an issue where we might pose a threat to them now, because humans have a way of taking technology, reverse engineering it, and making these things into terrible weapons. Because very few things are used for good, usually for war or money. Because there's war, there's money, right?
Absolutely.
So then, if we go back to the story of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, right? So you have these people that have this scheme to build a tower to get to the heavens. Those who are sitting in the heavens says, we can't let these guys build this because they're going to come up here and basically we're going to have a lot of trouble. They're going to take over. So they were trying to say, let's not give them all that technology right away. Well, unfortunately, we did receive that technology. If you go back to the Book of Enoch, or you go back to Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, where these I said rebel aliens. I'm going to go with rebel aliens came down and I guess took wives of human women. And these terrible things started happening with a blending of their DNA and ours. And
right.
we know how that went. So where does this take us? I think humans are kind of like the Borg in Star Trek, where we can take anything and I guess assimilate it. And I guess we could probably kick some alien ass, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Right.
So now I'm going to get to the question is to where, why haven't we got that experience since the 1800s like that, or even the Jesus or the Muhammad experience? We haven't had anything like a Moses. Why hasn't that happened?
Well, I've got several thoughts. I think you brought up a lot of great points there. To kind of succinctly answer your question, I think my theory on that is, again, when we're dealing with these entities that are on, for all intents and purposes, an infinite timeline, the 1800s was a snap of the finger ago for these people or these entities, whatever you want to call them. So, maybe we're just due for another one of these things. And in their timeline, last Tuesday, they were down here, giving Joseph Smith the Book of Mormon or whatever. Yes. So that's kind of my short answer. But kind of unpacking a little bit more of what you were talking about with like the Tower of Babel, and now humans might pose some sort of threat to these entities. You know, again, what do all these ancient stories say? We are made in the image of our gods. And we know what pieces of crap human beings can be. And we've got thousands of years of evidence that human beings are going to be pieces of crap. And, you know, you're talking about Genesis 6 and the Nephilim connections. And, you know, if we take into account made in the image of our creators, and this is something I joke around a lot about, but I think it's true, that story makes perfect sense. Because if we're made in the image of the gods, doesn't it make perfect sense, Junior, stop going down there and sleeping with the earth women? That's something that humans would do in that situation. And kind of bringing it all back to technology, you know, we saw this huge jump in UFO encounters, reports, whatnot, with the advent of nuclear technology, or the rediscovering of nuclear technology, if you want to go more, like you said, the Zachariah Sitchin route. But yeah, so I think you're very much onto something. Once we discovered / rediscovered nuclear technology, that could have been like the point in time where the scales kind of tipped. Maybe that was the new Tower of Babel. You know, we have become gods at this point. You know, Oppenheimer said, "I've become death, the destroyer of worlds." So I don't know. I think you're definitely onto something with all that, and that's an interesting way of thinking about the UFO phenomenon, in my opinion.
No, I think I'm 100% in agreement with you with a majority of that, my friend, because it makes too much sense. And if it makes sense to me, I'm thinking it might be true. And I'm thinking this is something that's happened in the past before. This is not the first time we've had to deal with forbidden technology where mankind pretty much obliterated itself.
Right.
If you want to take into account of these archaeological sites that were not found on the ground, that were found on the water, whole cities, whole civilizations, where you see these structures that are, I don't know, hundreds of feet under the water. How the hell did you get there? Well, something happened.
Right.
You can go back to Atlantis. You know, it seems possible. In Moria, it seems possible.
Yeah, and I mean, I think again, every culture has a story about a flood myth. You know, at some point, it takes almost more faith to believe that these are just stories than that this is at least very heavily based off of something that actually happened. And you know, you were talking about kind of your religious upbringing a few moments ago. I was raised Baptist, you know, heavily involved in the church my entire life, went to church camp every summer when I was a kid. But I always struggled with a lot of things about Christianity and religion. And I think once, well, kind of like you said, once you insert this missing puzzle piece into that framework, a lot of it makes more sense and a lot of it becomes easier to believe. And, you know, I don't think maybe the Bible is necessarily talking about what a lot of Christians think it is verbatim, but I believe the Bible more now than I ever have in my entire life. I just think it's maybe something a little bit different than a lot of religious folks want to admit.
Sure, you know, and what I always like to say is the Bible's kind of like the bare bones story of it's kind of like a walkthrough. It gives you what you need to get through it. And they're writing about things that were to them super important at that time. They're not worried about you knowing about UFOs or too much as far as fallen angels and those kind of things. They want to tell you here's the plan of salvation,
Right.
A, B, and C. You're going to get where you need to go. And it's one of those things. When I was heavily involved with the church at one point, I thought I wanted to be a youth minister and eventually become a pastor, you know, and move on down the line. A lot of things in my life changed, and that's okay. I would have been terrible at all those things. Let me just to be open with you on that. At that time, I had, and this is interesting. I had a guy, because I used to do Bible studies a lot. He was telling me things that you're now starting to hear in the church, where it's becoming I'm going to say accepted, but now people are getting to more to think. You have guys out there like Stephen Quayle, L.A. Marzulli, and Timothy Alberino, where these subjects are now, you cannot build the dam because the water's breaking, because this information is out there now. Because if you start reading, like I said, the Bible, and now that's more true now than ever, you can no longer ignore the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you consider these stories are people trying to describe indescribable things with the best information and the best vocabulary they have at the time, it just makes so much sense to me. Like, just take like the Nephilim stories, for example. One person's Nephilim is another person's extraterrestrial. You know, one person's demon is another person's extraterrestrial. And I think when you look at all those biblical accounts through that lens, it becomes a lot harder to deny that something legitimately strange is going on and has been going on for thousands of years. And it's, you know, at the end of the day, you know, everyday Christians are, you know, great people. That this is not to say anything against individual Christians or, you know, any denomination, but on a systematic level, you know, religion is a system to control people. And it's in that system's best interest for people to not think about, okay, well, what could this actually mean in real world terms? It's just to read the verses and go on to the next one. And again, not question too much. But with anything weird and strange and paranormal, whether it be cryptids, aliens, whatever, I always say you don't have to dig too far below the surface until you start seeing these weird connections between all this. And I think, you know, all these things are not completely isolated phenomena. It's all connected in some way. And I think what and where those connections are is what's so interesting in all this.
Yes, and because you have to go back to your inner thoughts where you think, well, what happened to these aliens?
Mm-hmm.
Where do they go? Are they still traveling from the stars to here? When you start thinking about how the universe works and how the solar system is going through the space at 1 billion miles an hour,
Mm-hmm.
and all the planets are circling each other, Earth is rotating, everything's in its perfect orbit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking if you're going to be whatever technology you have, let's say is I call it generic spaceship, and you're coming from some other galaxy to here, you have to have really, really good aim in order even just to make it to the solar system,
Right.
and then traverse through space debris. Then you have the asteroid belt. Then you got to find a planet that well, they seem habitable here.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to fight the gravity and coming through their atmosphere. Not so. There's a lot to this, which leads you to believe that perhaps interdimensional,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe the ones that made it here. Well, they never left.
Right.
Did they go underground? Are they shapeshifters where they're
Mm-hmm.
in human forms? Are they the classic reptilians who been here before mankind? So how does this work, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And, you know, I think the interdimensional kind of theory, like you said, that's kind of moving in the right direction. People are, you know, starting to think more along those lines, it seems like, in the UFO community now. And, you know, portals is kind of like a dirty word to some people, but wormholes, we pretty much, at least theoretically, understand that that's a real thing and how that works. That's a portal, if by another name. And I think when people talk about like aliens and, you know, space travel and things like that, people, a lot of people anyway, have this very rudimentary view of, okay, Mr. Alien is getting behind the wheel of his spaceship and driving to Earth. And no, that's not theoretically what's happening. They're basically, you know, Star Wars zapping from one place to the next. And again, if these people, entities, whatever you want to call them, are on an infinite timeline and are thousands and thousands, or God knows how many, maybe millions of years ahead of us, that's something that could just be standard technology to them. And it's not this mind blowing thing that we make it out to be, maybe.
You know, I'm thinking you're right, but let me bring this. I'm gonna pollute the timeline here a little bit, if you don't
Mhm.
mind. With
Yeah.
There is a theory out there that perhaps these extraterrestrials, they may not be extraterrestrials, that maybe they're just humans, time travelers.
Hmm.
And I guess as humans evolved, You remember Land of the Lost from the 70s? You ever
Yeah,
watched that?
yeah,
Like the Sleaze Stacks, right?
absolutely, yeah.
So there was one episode of the Sleaze Stacks where these things are kind of like humanoid reptilians, and
Hmm.
they're kind of really dumb anyway. They have these awful bow and arrow things, and
Hmm.
they make just awful noises as they walk. But one episode was one that had spoke perfect English, and well, his explanation was that these things are devolved,
Hmm.
and the one that was talking right, they were the evolved reptilians of the future of sorts. So,
Okay.
is it one of those things that where these evolved humans are coming back here trying to save mankind from itself, or is it just? I know I'm talking. It sounds like nonsense, but
No,
there's
not at
something
all.
out there that there's at least a theory out there. These are probably humans who are time travelers of sorts.
Yeah, I've heard that story on a few occasions. I haven't really dug too deep into it, or that theory rather, not a story. But I think that's interesting to think about, and it kind of, to me, all ties into kind of the ultra terrestrial or interdimensional theory. And I think, again, so much of this boils down to language. And I think sometimes people get caught up with, well, are they ultra terrestrials? Are they extraterrestrials? Are they interdimensional? Like, at the end of the day, I kind of feel like a lot of that's basically splitting hairs. These beings are something from somewhere else, whether that's inside the earth, whether that's another planet, whether that's another dimension. At the end of the day, I'm not sure how much practical difference that really makes. And I think that's just, it's kind of like with Bigfoot, and is it a flesh and blood entity or a more spiritual woo woo type thing? I think it's just something that has divided people and probably causes more conflict within, the community than necessary. Because if the flesh and blood um Sasquatch people are at war with the woo woo Sasquatch people, who are at war with the UFO people, who are at war with the ultra terrestrial people, we're never going to, like I said, find these connections and kind of this connective tissue that runs through all these things, which to me, I don't think we're ever going to quote unquote find concrete answers to a lot of these things. But like you said, it's more about the journey to me than finding an answer. And I think the most we can ever hope to find an answer is if everybody kind of puts these petty differences aside and like, okay, what's your opinion? What's your research telling you? And then we make this kind of more full picture with all the puzzle pieces.
True, because honestly, Oren, I don't care what it is.
Right.
I just want to know that it is
Mm-hmm.
basically. I know it's there. I'm telling you, I know there's something there.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
and it's like I tell everybody else, you don't know until it happens to you. Then you're gonna have a like life changing experience.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's paranormal, you come in contact with a Bigfoot, or you're an experiencer, you actually been abducted by a UFO, and so on. Uh, the main goal is to know that they finally found something. Let's not. I don't care what kind of car it is. I don't care if it's a Maserati, a Toyota, or a Yugo. I just want to know, does that car exist?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Let's discuss it.
Right.
So it's not going to change anything in our lives, really. Which brings you to the whole thing of what's happening here with I'll call it soft disclosure when the government's
Mm-hmm.
going out there. I'm not going to call them. They're not really called show trials. It's not like a show trial, but it's one of those things to where I like what's happening, but if they're talking about it, now I'm already suspect. Are you just giving me
Mm-hmm.
misinformation
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
to make us happy and go back and watch your Ancient Aliens on History Channel and eat your hot dogs and be happy, right? Drink your beer, watch your wrestling, do your
Right.
thing. My opinion only, and I'm not trying to make anybody upset, where possibly something is going on, but not everything has to be, I'll call it extraterrestrial, but
Mm-hmm.
related. It could be that they don't want us to know what this is because hey, there could be a national security issue here.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. No, I think a lot of, this kind of disclosure and all the hearings that have been going on for the past year or so, a lot of it, just doesn't quite sit right with me. Like, I've joked around, but not really joking about this. Oh, so now we're going to start trusting what the government says? They're telling the truth now. So I think, at best, all this is a controlled narrative. And again, if it gets people thinking and researching and looking into things on their own, it's a net positive. But for anyone, especially people who are in the paranormal or the UFO community, to just blindly accept anything that's being said in these hearings, I think is asinine. Like, when has the government ever said or done or told the truth any more than they absolutely have to? And like you said, I think a lot of this could be, we've just got to the point where there absolutely is something going on. People have telephones and cameras and supercomputers in their pocket every day. They've got to acknowledge something. And I kind of feel like a lot of this is the government just giving themselves plausible deniability. Because when, something does happen, they can be like, oh, we told you guys there's something going on. We just didn't quite know what it was. So yeah, I think at the very best, that's what's going on. And at the very worst, it's, like I said, just pure misinformation and a controlled narrative and trying to actively lead people away from whatever the quote unquote truth is.
Yes, because I mean, there's so much out there right now. We're not only talking about UFOs, we're talking about cryptids, talking about paranormal,
Mm-hmm.
and at least in those two instances, the average person can go out there and explore and investigate and probably get some positive results.
Right.
Because I know you're not only interested in research UFOs, but you also do cryptids and
Mm-hmm.
also the paranormal. So, what have you seen so far? Have you had a paranormal experience or cryptids or anything like that?
So not really. The Men in Black encounter is probably like the weirdest thing that's personally happened to me. Kind of piggybacking off of that, and I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. But in that same area where I grew up, like we said, there's a lot of kind of weird things that have gone on. So here in the past few years, both of my parents passed away. And at that point, my sister was living in our childhood home for a while we were trying to get, everything cleaned up and all of the affairs in order and just things you have to do when that happens. And she began having a lot of very strange paranormal experiences in that house. Just things as simple as she would go out to her car every morning and like the battery would be dead. So, buys a new battery, goes out the next morning, the battery's dead again. And, as well as I do, dying car batteries are a big thing in any type of UFO or paranormal or cryptid case. But just kind of the story that I think is the funnest one to tell that happened to her is, she said she was laying in bed one night. It was probably like 10 o'clock at night. And she said this voice, like it wasn't like a voice she heard. It was like a thought was beamed into her own head. Go look on top of the refrigerator. So she went out and looked on top of the refrigerator. And in our kitchen, there was like, you know how people will have like decorative like chickens in their kitchen, like little statue type things. And on top of the refrigerator, there were these 3 decorative chickens. Well, the bodies had been ripped off of these 3 chickens. So it was just the 3 sets of legs on top of the refrigerator. So she calls me, 10 o'clock at night, freaking out. I said, this is trickster paranormal type behavior, poltergeist type stuff. I said, I joked with her, in a couple weeks, you're probably going to find them in the mailbox or something like that. But not to get too deep into anything, but like I said, my parents had both recently died. There was a lot of family drama and stuff going on, a lot of negativity being dumped into this location and this area where, there's kind of weird things going on anyway. And, a lot of people talk about this idea that negative energy and death and things like that even further can thin the veil. And so I think, she was experiencing these weird things because, one, we were in a weird place and all this negative energy was being poured on top of that. And so, again, long-winded answer, but I haven't really experienced anything that I would consider paranormal, but my sister absolutely has. And it's kind of all tied into the Men in Black story, I think, that we started at the top of the show with. So,
And I think everything's connected from Bigfoot
Mhm.
to spirits, UFOs. There's a connection there somewhere, and
Absolutely.
all seems to be centered around Earth and us. Interesting enough, I didn't know that humans were that interesting, but we seem to be interesting to a lot of things. And with the UFO framework, UFO Research Center, what kind of work you've done so far with that? Is that still quite a new organization, right?
Well, so again, you in your wonderful intro made me sound more official and legitimate than I really am. No, so when I first started kind of researching all this stuff heavily, me and my partner Jenny, who you met at Cryptid Halloween, she, funny enough, was experiencing some kind of paranormal stuff in the apartment she used to live in while I was like really diving deep into this. And so we were like, we need to start going to conventions. We need to start trying to talk to people and meet people such as yourself. And so at that point, I was doing research and I was like compiling notes. And, my initial idea was to write some sort of book at some point. And I was like, we need like a business card. We need something just so we can put in people's hands. And I was like, well, let's come up with, a UFO Research Center. And I called it the framework. And this kind of ties into our earlier conversation as well. I think all this stuff is connected. And I think, again, you don't have to dig very low below the surface till you start seeing the connections between all these things. And I think that we should all question the narratives we've been told. I think we should all do our own research and start seeing these connections and building our own framework of thought. And that's why I called it that. So basically, the Framework UFO Research Center is me diddling on the keyboard by myself, but I just felt like I needed a name and something to put in people's hands, and that's kind of where
No,
it came from, and that's why I called it that. So
don't undersell yourself, man. There's titans of industries right now as we live and breathe, my friend. Where everything started in a garage or in the office in a 1-bedroom apartment. You never know. But here's
Right.
here's the thing with that. MUFON does a lot of terrific work, but there aren't as many groups because paranormal is a dime a dozen groups, and nothing wrong with that. Where not many UFO researchers out there, at least not on that I've seen. So I think that the advantage you have, my friend, is you're probably going to be running into a lot of these stories that are lesser known that MUFON may not even touch because they don't even know. And what you're doing, gathering this evidence and information and interviewing the people, I think will do a terrific service to what we do.
Well, and at the end of the day, I think that's why podcasts have been such a good thing for the community as a whole. And it's been a good thing for people that, like you said, have experienced weird things and they never had a frame of reference. It was just, oh, this weird thing happened to me. And you might hear a podcast and somebody tells a story and they're, oh my God, that's what happened to me. And so it does a number of good things. It makes these people not think they're crazy and not think they're alone. And then people like us that are weirdos and are just, head over heels about this sort of thing, we can connect and we can all swap stories and talk and, theorize about things. So I think, and this is again bringing it back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, technology had to get to a point where people were able to share this information and able to share thoughts and theories. And, there's a million podcasts out there, but at the end of the day, I think it's a very good thing. And I think people would not be as perceptive of the phenomenon and something strange going on if it wasn't for the platform of podcasts, because it's approachable. It's not a show on Discovery Channel. It's something tangible that people can listen to. They can, they can talk to these people. They can reach out to them. And I think that's a big reason why the disclosure stuff is going on now, because there's so many people looking into things than ever before, and they've got to come out and say something.
True. And talking about being reachable for the listeners of Let's Find Out, they want to learn more about what you and your partner do. And of course, listen to your wonderful podcast, as I do all the time as well.
I appreciate that, sir.
Where can they go, learn more about what you do, and where can they find out?
Okay, so if you guys want to get up with me for any reason whatsoever, Instagram is where I'm most active. My handle is at the Framework UFO. I'm again on the Bizarre Encounters podcast with our mutual friend Shane Jones. He's got a couple great podcasts you guys should listen to and check out. So you can find me either through my own personal page. If you search Bizarre Encounters, you can find a lot of information about the show. You can get up with me that way. So I'm not hard to find. If anybody wants to reach out to me for any reason whatsoever, I'm not the best at checking my messages, but I'll get back to you as quick as I can. And, always like talking to people and hearing their stories and their thoughts on things.
Good, because I was about to take it really personal.
Go for it.
Taking back the messages, not getting back. No, that's okay, because we're all the same way. We got so much things going on anyway.
Yeah.
Outside of podcasts and then reaching out to the guests and setting up schedules, man. Sometimes it could be 3 days before I get back to you. So don't feel bad the same way. It's how it goes with the line of work that we do. So
hey, at the end of the day, we're all just doing the best we can, right?
Absolutely right. So I know we just saw each other at Crypto Halloween not long ago, and I know this is the slow season now. So what are you going to be doing next? What's coming up for you?
So kind of like we were talking about a little bit before we started filming, couple of the events that we went to this past year, they're not holding them this year. So me and my partner Jenny, we're kind of tentatively planning to go to the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot conference in Gatlinburg next summer. That's a great event. It's downtown Gatlinburg at the convention center. They always have a ton of really high profile guests there. So that's kind of the one we have on our radar, the big event probably for next year. And then, like we said, anything that Dave, aka the Snarly Owl, does, we're going to try to be there for that. So nothing really set in stone, but kind of that's what's tentatively on the schedule. And again, if you guys want to ever cross paths with us, I'll make posts about, where we're going to be and what we're going to be doing on Instagram. So again, that's the best way to kind of get up with any of us and get any information about what we got going on.
Excellent, man. I look forward to seeing you, your partner, next year at Crypto Halloween 4. You guys always come up here to the nice West by God, Virginia. I think it's time for me to start going in Carolina. It's been almost 20 years since I visited. Lovely state, man. I look forward to seeing you next year, my friend.
Well, we'd love to have you down here. If you ever make your way down to the Carolinas, we will show you around old Raleighwood here. So thank you for inviting me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's always great to talk to you, and I've enjoyed this a lot. So thank you so much.
Awesome, my brother. This has been another excellent episode of Let's Find Out with Diego. Please check us out on all our social media pages, as well as on YouTube and Rumble. Like, share, and subscribe. Also, Let's Find Out is on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. Catch the show on Saturdays at 2 a.m. For more information, please visit KGRADB.com. That's KGRADB.com. Together, we will get one step closer to finding out. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Until next time, my friends.
Let's find out with Diego, the power of Diego Mania. All content for Let's Find Out is property of co-host Diego and is served directly from our servers with no modification, redirects, or rehosting. All celebrity impersonators are paid performers. The impersonated celebrities do not endorse or promote any views or opinions expressed by our guests, co-host Diego, or Let's Find Out. The information shared on Let's Find Out is provided on an as-is basis, with no guarantees of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness.